Hello and welcome to the A-Plus Guide to IT Technical Support, 9th edition, Chapter 3 Review. The title of this chapter is All About Motherboards. This chapter is of a similar length as the previous ones that we've reviewed. It's 58 slides long, and I estimate it's probably going to take 90-ish minutes for us to complete, maybe a little less. So let's get started. So here are the objectives. Describe and contrast various types and features of motherboards. Configure a motherboard using BIOS or UEFI firmware. Maintain a motherboard including updating drivers, flashing UEFI BIOS, and replacing CMOS batteries. And select, install, and replace a motherboard. So the motherboard, as we're going to see, is the heart of your PC, your server, right? It is the primary landing pad, if you will, for all the other components. It is home to your CPU, your DIMMs. It's what gives the power supply something to do, right? It is the largest single component in your server or your PC. And today's motherboards are pretty modular. So what I mean by that is, and I had mentioned this in a previous slide, modern motherboards are designed to be toolless as much as possible for reasons that we had previously discussed, and to be easy to add new features to. So once upon a time, really in the not so distant past, adding a hard drive was a fairly complex thing to do. You had to worry about jumper positions on the motherboard. You had to be concerned about how the operating system was going to access the hard drive. And with today's motherboards, much of that is taken care of for you. For example, with adding additional hard drives, generally speaking, you don't have to worry about jumper positions, either rocker switches, which modern motherboards don't have, or jumpers on the drives themselves. So it really has become much easier. Also with that, if you're maintaining a motherboard and for the sake of argument, something breaks, there's really nothing to repair. Today's motherboards are small enough, dense enough, that if a component goes bad, a chipset, an onboard port, the only option that you really have is to replace the entire motherboard, which we can talk about that perhaps later in this review. That can put your entire system at risk. So we will do some of these exercises in class. Of course, they'll all be virtual, as I have recommended with other classes or other slides. If you have the possibility of doing this with a real server, with a real PC, even if you have to buy an inexpensive one, say on Craigslist or something, another classified ad, it's certainly worth the exercise. And for our purposes, at least now, that PC doesn't even need to be working. Perhaps it'd be better the first time you took it apart. If it didn't, then you wouldn't have as much concern about putting everything right the first time. So this chapter is full of new jargon. We have lots of pictures to share, and it is really important that as an IT technician, right, as a technologist, that you understand many of these basic ports and how to properly work on a PC and change out a motherboard if needed. So let's continue. Motherboard types. Motherboard is the most complicated computer component. Well, it is and it isn't. Really, it's a big circuit board. So if you wanted to think of it in terms of just a big expansion card, really it's built in the same way. It's just bigger. So with bigger comes more chipsets, more slots, more, right? There's just more of everything. And it is what everything else attaches to. But as I just said, there's not much that you can do to configure it, right? There's very little in the way that you can do to adjust or repair it. So in that way, at least, the motherboards are a lot simpler. It's you put them in, you plug other components into it, and for the most part, that's all you need to do. Now, we'll get into a discussion later on with BIOS versus UEFI and how you might have to configure your software settings different depending on your motherboard type. But in terms of physically altering the board, making changes to the board itself, there's not that much to be done with a modern motherboard. We're going to look at some older types, but with regard to a modern motherboard, there's really not much for you to adjust. So it's one of the first items to consider when building a computer. So many of you may decide to build your own PC. Perhaps you've already done that, and there are plenty of companies out there willing to help you do that. Newegg is one such example, and it can be quite a lot of fun to do that. I recommend that if you have the appetite for it, you should do it. Not everybody's going to have the interest in building a motherboard, selecting the components, selecting all the other items that are paired with it. For example, the CPU and how many cores should I get, and how much memory should I get, and should I get an ATX or a mini ATX motherboard. There are a lot of decisions that go into it. So there's also plenty of companies out there, Dell, HP, Lenovo, that would be happy to sell you a computer that you configure on their website, and then they assemble it to your specifications. Neither way is necessarily wrong. You might save a slight bit of money on building your own PC, perhaps more so if you are a gamer and you want to build a high-end box. If your interest really is in building a vanilla PC, just checking email, surfing the web, maybe doing a few video conference calls, taking online classes, you don't need a high-end piece of hardware to do that. So if that is your, if that describes your server or your PC, then you're probably best just to go buy one off the shelf. You'll probably save some money, again, if that's your objective. If you just want the challenge and the thrill of doing it, well then, by all means, build your own PC. So, things to consider when you're building your PC. We've talked about a number of these already. Form factor, which is really the footprint, right? Is it a big tower or a little tower? Is it a desktop so that it lies flat? Is it a tiny? Tinies are a class of PCs that mount to monitors or easily hidden inside of a kiosk or something like that. It's different than an all-in-one. It's actually a detachable standalone PC, but yeah, it's called a tiny. Processor, socket, and chipset. Do you want one processor? Do you need two processors? Do you want the ability to expand later on? Buses and number of slots. So buses, you can think of as a bus as a direct channel to your CPU. You also have something called a north bridge and a south bridge, which we explore later in this slide deck. But for the most part, your PC slots are provide a direct path to your CPU, and so you need to select those cards carefully. Also, the slots are given different preference and different speeds, which again we'll get into later in this slide deck. But there are a lot of considerations to go through if you decide to build your own PC, or even if you decide to build a configure a pre-built one by, again, the likes of HP, Lenovo, Dell, Asus, and others. So, motherboard form factors. So the size of the motherboard obviously determines the size of the case that it needs to fit into. So if you want a large desktop PC, then towers are probably the most common form factor these days. And you can see why for a number of reasons. They fit nicely under a desk. If you need to reach down and put in a USB key or power it off, it's easily accessible. Doesn't take up any desk space, obviously, if it's under the desk. And by sitting upright, the power supply is the furthest away from the floor, as opposed to lying flat on the floor, and that reduces to a minor extent the amount of dust that you might pull into the box. So it really depends on how much space you have to work on or work in, and the choices will be individual, but there is no wrong choice. Just because most people build towers obviously doesn't mean that you need to build a tower. You may prefer something else because of your unique office needs. The most popular models for motherboards: ATX, Micro ATX, and Mini ITX. Now, it's probably going to take a little time for those terms to sink in so that you really know what you're describing when you use those terms. This chapter, plus the material that's on MindTap, will go a long way, I think, in helping you to understand the subtle differences between those, well, some of them not so subtle, but the differences between those boards. The following slides show examples of form factors and comparisons of sides and whole possibilities of several form factors. So here we have I'll go ahead and say this is an old motherboard. And the reason I know this is an old motherboard, among other things, is the tower right here in the front with all these audio ports. That's what these colored ports are for. Colored serial connections for audio, speaker left, speaker right, and microphone. Plus, you've got a lot of other components that are built into the board. Over here on the left side, you have a combination PS2 port. That'll be for your mouse and your keyboard. So modern computers, modern PCs will not have this port tower for the entertainment systems. It also won't have a PS2 port. Those have largely been retired, both of them, in favor of USB or other high-speed serial connections. Also, your serial connection here may also be retired, and that's a simple reason because we have other ways of transferring material, or can't seem to get this right, transferring data using faster methods. For example, FireWire is a common serial method. So this serial port, which means that you're sending data down a cable one bit at a time, you're sending it like a line of soldiers, as opposed to a parallel, which would send several bits of data at one time. Parallel cables were primarily used for PCs, which, as you guessed it, we have other high-speed ways of doing that, principally USB. So USB has become sort of the de facto port selection and has replaced a lot of the ports that we see on this particular board. But for the purpose of this test in this class, then it's important that you understand some of the features for this particular mini ITX motherboard. Here are some of the specifications. Again, because of its age and it's getting sort of long in the tooth, I don't know that I would bother trying to commit any of these to memory. If you think that you would like to open up, I don't know, if your long-range career plan is to open up some sort of repair shop, then it may be a good idea. You might be an authorized vendor for any one of a number of different PC companies. Well, in that case, you would need to develop skills that would allow you to be expert with this material and recall it easily without having to look it up. But for the purposes of this class, and for those of you that are not pursuing an IT career, then, like I said, I'm not sure I would commit this slide to memory, but be aware of it. All right, processor sockets. So a processor socket determines which processors a board can support. So the modern CPUs will fit in with a PGA pin grid array that will plug directly into the motherboard, and there are different types of socket locking mechanisms. On top of that, you will have a heatsink that's will be held down by some sort of spring-loaded clip, little thermal grease in between, and that describes most pin grid array PGA attachments for a CPU. The CPU also has it's keyed, which means that it can only go in one way. And not only that, but when you put the CPU over the socket, it should simply drop into place. So you should never force a CPU into the socket. Now, there are other form factors that are installed a little differently. Those are older. We're not going to discuss those here. But for a modern PC with a PGA pin grid array construction, that socket should, and that CPU should go together effortlessly and be held in place with some sort of spring-loaded square frame that fits on top of it. We'll see some examples of that here in just a few minutes. Sockets for Intel processors. Intel makes several Itanium and Xeon processors designed for servers. Xeon is by far their dominant chipset or their dominant chip line. Itanium is still around, but it had there were flaws with that and wasn't widely adopted like the Xeon processors were. Most of your mid-range mid-range servers, for example, will use the Xeon processor line. Processor sockets. Sockets and processors use different methods to make contact between them. So the one I just mentioned, for example, the PGA, is the most common. and that is if you were to remove the CPU from the motherboard, you would see on the bottom of that CPU there are a bunch of pins sticking out. Okay, the opposite of that is the one that's shown here next, which is the LGA, and the LGA reverses this. The LGA has very small pads on the CPU, and when you put the CPU in the install it into the motherboard, it will mate with the pins that are on the motherboard. Now the pins on the motherboard are hidden until you latch the CPU in place, and the reason that this is done is it's really easy to drop a CPU when you're just about to position it into place, and if you drop it, you can bend the pins either on the CPU with either side, right? So if the pins are on the CPU or the pins are on the socket, you could drop the CPU and bend it. And if you're lucky, you'll see an error right away. But if you're not, you're likely to miss it and end up with intermittent errors. So the LGA is the more recent forms of that have a cover, so that when the CPU is removed and the socket is open, we'll say, the pins are hidden, they're covered, and when you put the CPU in place and then latch it down, the latching mechanism slides over this plate that otherwise hides or protects the pins, and then connects those with the CPU. So that particular one is the dominant form of connection for servers. Most of your mid-range servers, 1U and 2U boxes, will use the LGA, whereas you will find most of your PCs are using the PGA. So LAN grid array uses LANs, pads rather than pins. Again, that's for safety. Examples of LGA sockets, LGA 775 and 1366. Again, if you want to impress your friends and family with just how much of a geek you're becoming as a part of taking this class, then you might want to memorize those terms. But again, I don't know that I would recommend that otherwise. And then finally, something called a flip chip LAN grid array. Is a somewhat more, as the name would suggest, right, somewhat more complicated. It is used for small form factor systems. So if you'll read here, it says the chip is flipped so that the top of the chip makes contact with the bottom, and it's again for very small spaces, but not in wide use. Again, the two listed before that, the PGA and the LGA, are by far the two dominant sockets on motherboards today. Continuing, sockets and processors use different methods to make contacts. Staggered pin array and then a ball grid array. Again, not as common anymore. LGA, PGA are the most common, but these get an honorable mention. Pins are staggered over the socket. Squeezes more pins into a small space for the staggered pin grid array. Density is important, right? So if you can make your systems more compact, then that saves room for other components. And then BGA, ball grid array, it's not a socket at all, at least according to this author. The processor is soldered to the motherboard. So that's normally reserved for chipsets these days. So you might have your networking chipset or perhaps an audio chipset that's soldered to the motherboard. But the primary CPU or CPUs, if you've got a multi-CPU system, would not be. And it's pretty clear to see why, right? If anything goes wrong with your CPU, instead of throwing out the entire system, right, getting rid of the entire motherboard, including the most important part, which is your CPU, you can swap components. So soldering certainly a CPU to a motherboard is not preferred. So here's some examples. Now, it might be a little hard to make out in this particular picture, but this is the LGA, right? That says that there in the caption. And so in this particular style of sockets, the pins are actually exposed. So in later versions of this socket, there is a plate that sits on top of them. so that while that square cover plate, that silver squarish plate that's open right now in this photo, when that is open, there's a lever mechanism that slides a plate out on top of the pins so that you can't accidentally drop the CPU, or worse yet, a screwdriver or something else, maybe even hair. There are lots of things that you would not want to get into that CPU socket. So, but this shows an example. Same basic mechanism, right? It opens up. It's hinged in this case, on the back, and the locking mechanism, which is in the foreground, which is kind of where my arrow is kind of a spring-loaded arm. So it does hold it securely in place. You will, of course, need thermal grease to properly install your CPU, because once you have it in your LGA socket, you'll need to put a heatsink on top of it. And it's not enough just to have metal on metal. You might have some gaps, even if they're really small. You need to put to make sure that you put the right amount of thermal grease on there to make sure that the heat dispersion from the chip is uniform. Okay. Zero insertion force sockets, all current processor sockets. And that's still an accurate statement, even though the slide deck here, as you see at the bottom, is 2017. The zero insertion force sockets are very easy, and as I said previously, you should never ever force a socket into its home. It is keyed to go one way. If you look at a CPU, you'll see that in one corner it should have a small gold triangle that's etched onto the CPU, and that should match up with a similar triangle that's on the socket itself. Plus, if you flip the socket upside down, you'll notice that in that same corner where that gold triangle is, there's a pin that's missing. And so it's sort of dog-eared, right? Got a corner that's cut off, and you'll be able to look at that and then look at the socket and see that there's a dog-eared setting there too, or dog-eared looking plug too, because correspondingly it's missing a pin. So combined with those two, you should be able to install your socket simply by gently lowering it in place. It only goes one way. And if it truly won't drop in, then you should stop, right? Look at what the problem is, see if there's a bent pin or if something's wrong with the socket itself. But please proceed cautiously when you're working with the CPU, because it is, after all, the most expensive item, single most item in your PC. All right, so processor sockets. So here's a lot of details. Again, I'm not going to go over these in any detail. I encourage you to take some time just to kind of be aware of some of the perhaps the buzzwords and some of the different capacities that are discussed in terms of these different types of socket or brackets for your CPU. Again, I'm not going to ask that you memorize it, and I don't know that really overall it's a good use of your time in this class. But this slide deck will be made available to you, and you can review it at your leisure. So here's an example again of a ZIF socket. This one's a slightly different processor, but it plugs in the same way. This is AMD, and AMD has for decades been Intel's primary rival. And the Intel certainly has a much larger market share, but the folks at AMD have put out some really nice hardware. They just haven't gotten the same sort of market penetration that Intel has. Plus, on the plus side for Intel, there have been a couple of times where AMD almost went out of business. And who should come to the rescue but Intel? So they kind of need AMD, Intel does, even though they're the big kid on the block, because without them, they would be subject to all sorts of antitrust concerns, and being the only chip provider in the market invites a different level of government scrutiny than if you have a true competitor. So AMD and Intel are the two largest chip companies, U.S. chip companies, and Intel certainly does dominate the market. They're the 600-pound gorilla in the room. But don't discount AMD if you're shopping for a new system. Then they certainly do put out some very good hardware. Their CPUs are just as reliable as Intel. They have different specifications, as you might imagine, but they are certainly worthy of consideration. Plus, in many cases, the AMD chipset is less expensive. So if you're shopping for a new PC, again, if you see AMD on the box, don't let that scare you. They've been in business for a very long time, and their hardware is just as robust and just as capable as its Intel equivalent. All right, chipset. Chipsets are specialized clusters of chips. It may be actually a single chip, or it may be several that do a particular function. And this slide deck, or this particular slide rather, starts to describe some of that. So you can have a chipset that's dedicated to memory, motherboard buses, and then certain peripherals. So chipsets are made by Intel and AMD. They're every bit a chip in the way that a CPU is. They're just smaller, more limited, perhaps dedicated to a particular function. So Intel chipsets make Northbridge and Southbridge controllers, or chipsets in this instance, and those handle different types of communications into the CPU. So generally speaking, your Northbridge handles high-speed I/O. So for example, your DIMMs would be attached to the Northbridge. And it's also worth noting that your Northbridge, if you were to look at a motherboard, you would see that the Northbridge chipset is closer, physically closer on the motherboard to the CPU than the Southbridge, which typically uses or services slower I/O devices. For example, your keyboard, your mouse, speakers, anything plugged into the back would be considered a slower port, and for that reason, that I/O is directed through the Southbridge. So those two chipsets together control all of the traffic going in and out of the CPU. And again, the high-speed traffic, the high-speed bus is the Northbridge, and the slower speed is the Southbridge. So anything USB, again, anything connected to the rear of your server or PC is going to be connected to the Southbridge. So, and here's a little diagram to help reinforce this. This one probably is worth trying to commit to memory, even if at a high level, so that when you're taking a certification exam, that you have ready command of this information. So, and this particular diagram, this motherboard layout where you have this primary brain, the processor, that's being serviced by these two smaller brains, the Northbridge and the Southbridge, that sort of design has been with us for a very long time. And because it's expensive to redesign motherboards, if you're an OEM, original equipment manufacturer, then it's likely to be with us for a very long time. So, continuing to specific types of chipsets. Now, if you have worked in IT recently, then you might hear the projects that build PCs or servers referenced by the chip or chipset that they're using. I know that's certainly been the case in my time with IBM and Lenovo. So and then you have different versions of the chip that fall within these generations. So the chipsets listed here, right? Sandy Bridge and the Neolem chipset give you an idea of what generation that you're working with. Again, in this example, Sandy Bridge is the newer chipset. You notice that it uses second generation Core i7 processors, and that it is probably the de facto standard right now. If you were to go shop for any consumer PC, you would likely see that the motherboard is servicing some sort of i7 processor. Now, not all i7 processors are the same. They have different numbers of core. They have different levels or different amount of onboard memory. That's the cache memory that's actually on the CPU. That can have a big difference depending on what you're doing. If in general, when you're building a PC or selecting one, my advice to you is what it's been for many years, which is buy the most PC that you can at the time of purchase. I would discourage you from buying a PC and not getting all the memory or not getting a faster processor with the idea that, I'll come back later and add some more if I need to. I would dissuade you from doing that. Buy the most PC you can. Plan on that PC to last 3 to 5 years, and then beyond that, look at buying a new PC. Because once you've had your PC for 3 to 5 years, you've really, that's its expected lifespan, and you will probably find that the hardware that's available at that time will be sufficiently faster or better, just all around better, right? More robust, perhaps it's smaller, perhaps it uses less energy, more storage, more DIMMs, right? You'll probably find that the hardware is vastly superior to the hardware that you bought 3 to 5 years ago. So again, with regard to memorizing the information on this slide, I would read it for awareness, but I don't know that I would commit it to memory. And here is another slide, x58 chipset architecture. So again, we have the North Bridge and the South Bridge listed here, and Micron, Intel and AMD both build motherboards and CPUs, and both use this sort of frame of reference technology. I know in this slide that they have the Intel Core i7 listed at the very top, but again, AMD builds out their hardware in much the same way. Intel chipsets continued. Ivy Bridge, 3rd generation. Again, so that was released 8 years ago, which in computer years, right? Dog years are bad enough. Computer years are worse. That's 8 years ago. So that's considered very old technology at this point. Not to say that it wouldn't comfortably handle doing email and some other videos. So if you've got an older system, it certainly can still function, but it's going to have 16-bit technology. The software that runs on top of it's not going to be as sophisticated as perhaps you're used to running. And generally, if you are using a PC that is that old, then you should look for opportunities to upgrade. If for no other reason, then you can run 64-bit operating systems on top of it. Okay. Haswell and Broadwell chipset. So we're getting a little earlier. Each one of these chips is the families, and again, these are chip families. So if we look at Haswell and Broadwell, each one is providing additional tweaks. So with Haswell, for example, it uses less power than Sandy Bridge. Broadwell, its claim to fame is that it's faster than both Ivy Bridge and Haswell. So it's each chipset, each of the major releases, not the minor releases, kind of like software, but each of the major releases will have significant improvements in the hardware. Okay. Now we move to AMD. So AMD again is every bit as capable as Intel. So they're only really last 3-4 years been making steady roads into consumer products. For a long time, they were more of a data center purchase than a consumer buy, but you're starting to see them in devices like laptops and tablets and other portable IT devices. So don't let AMD, if you've not heard of them before, don't be dissuaded. They are several decades old and are worthy of a look. Plus, as I mentioned earlier, you'll probably save a little bit if you decide to go with an AMD over an Intel. So, what comes next is not proprietary. What we saw with AMD and Intel on the previous slides was proprietary. It was particular to those manufacturers. So these terms, buses and expansion slots, apply to both manufacturers and really any other computer-like device. That would be servers, that would be PCs or tablets, or even routers and switches, since those really are just specialized PCs. So let's take a quick review of this, and if you have questions, let me know. These terms are worthy of committing to memory. So with that said, let's take a look at the first term, bus, a system of pathways used for communication. As I mentioned previously, a bus provides a direct line of communication to the CPU, either through the North Bridge or the South Bridge. And this is the question I usually ask in class. I'll ask my students, how many executions or how many things, actually I break it down even simpler than that, how many things can your CPU do at one time? And I'll get lots of good answers. But the truth of the matter is that for all its technical ability, right? It may be 3 gigahertz, it may have a ton of onboard cache, it may be the heart of your super powerful PC or server. But at the end of the day, that CPU is really only capable of doing one thing at the time. Now, before you question what I'm saying, here's how that works, right? So your CPU runs very, very quickly, right? I just mentioned an example of a 3 gigahertz CPU. So what happens is that the North Bridge and the South Bridge, they control interrupts into the CPU to handle different tasks. And the IRQs, as they are called, have different weights and are responded to differently. But for our example, we'll say that it works this way. Requests come into the CPU, and the CPU is like a merry-go-round that's spinning at 3 gigahertz, right? So it's spinning so quickly, it gives you the illusion, you as the user, that it's doing everything simultaneously, when really it's more like, the Flash. It's going through and doing a little bit of each job, one at the time, but it's doing it so quickly that it gives you the illusion that it's doing it simultaneously, that it is a true multitasking system. And yeah, when it's not. Now you might ask, so what if I have multiple CPUs? What if I have, a specialized video card that has its own CPU on it, or a RAID card, same thing. It's got its own brain, own CPU. Same thing with certain NIC cards. They may have their own intelligence. Yes, that will definitely change the behavior a little bit. But remember, for the CPU for the server or the PC to operate properly, the CPU, the main CPU, is the one that sets the tone, if you will, kind of the pace car for all the other devices on your motherboard. So it runs at a specific speed that's set by a quartz clock that's built into the motherboard. All the other devices need that clock signal in order to operate efficiently. So, and that at a very high level is what a bus does. A bus is a pathway, as it says here, but it's more than that, right? It's a conduit. It's a direct street, if we want to use that analogy, to your house, which is in this case the CPU. And that's done for a number of reasons, right? So the North Bridge and the South Bridge were deliberately created to split traffic across the motherboard into two different groups. Your high-speed priority traffic has a faster North Bridge connected to the CPU, because this is the emergency. It has to be handled right now, information that's trying to get to your CPU. The South Bridge, although don't get me wrong, it's still very fast, it can wait a little bit, right? So Some people won't like this analogy, but maybe the north bridge is your wife and the south bridge is your mother. And you got to answer the call from the wife because you really want to keep her happy. And well, I'm going to keep mom happy too, but maybe I'll call her back a little later. Still going to call her, just going to call her back a little later. Same kind of thing. So what kind of things does the bus carry? Well, in addition to data, right, it can carry power to the device. Power over Ethernet is one example. Control signals, memory addresses, really everything about what the CPU needs to know to execute a particular function. So memory addresses, right, where's data stored on your DIMMs, right? It can also actually have the real data involved. So and that needs to be moved across the bus to various locations on your PC. So a video signal is a great example of this, as you might be watching something streaming on Netflix or Amazon. Those signals are CPU intensive. So they come in through the north bridge, or sorry, actually that'd be a south bridge because it's probably going to come in through your Ethernet port. It's going to come in through your south bridge, and the south bridge chipset is going to have to send most, if not all of that, through your CPU. Now, if you've got a video card installed or some other device that's handling that traffic for you, then that might change it a little bit. But we're going to keep our conversations here kind of simple, which means that you've got a built-in, in this case, built-in RJ45 plug. Or wireless, right? Maybe you're sitting and watching something on your laptop, but it comes in, hits that chipset for the network card, and the network card we know is considered a slower device. Network card goes to the south bridge, and the south bridge sends it to the CPU, which then processes the data and sends it back out so it can go to your multimedia chipset or your your audio visual chipset, whatever may be handling those features for you, and then that's displayed to your screen. So input, output, I/O is it takes several different components to process that for you, so that you can see your whatever you're binge watching on Netflix or Amazon. But the CPU is the one that handles all of that throughput. So that's why, for example, if you are doing several CPU intensive activities, like maybe watching a movie, maybe you're trying to play a game, you can see some real lag time depending on just how robust your PC is. Also, it's worth mentioning that if I recommended earlier that you buy the most PC that you can, which includes the fastest performing processor, as well as the most memory and the fastest storage. Don't confuse the two. The fastest storage that you can buy, because again, your DIMM is temporary storage. That's being there are 3 data states. So data in use and data in motion, certainly data in use, will use the DIMM to temporarily store information before it gets used or sent to storage. So when the PC is shut down, any information that you have in the DIMM is lost. It has to be electrically active to retain that. So that's a DIMM. Now storage is your hard drive, and the hard drive comes in many different forms. Could be an SSD, could be a SAS drive, could be a SATA drive, could be a USB drive even. Which is, I guess, a form of SSD. But anyway, several different storage options there. But the CPU again handles all of that. So if you've got some slowdowns, and here is where I was going with that, then look at your memory and look at your NIC card, right? So in a laptop, there's probably not much you can do about the NIC. You may be able to make some improvements with your memory, maybe add a little bit more. But in a PC, however, if you've got a tower PC, for example, and you've got a lot of space inside the chassis, you may be able to add some additional memory. You might even be able to swap out the CPU if you can find a good deal. But you've got more room to maneuver inside that tower PC than you do inside of a laptop. Plus, a laptop motherboard is kind of small, and it may be kind of oddly shaped. So you can, if you see one, and I'm not sure if we have a picture of that later in this slide deck or not, but if you were to see a picture of a motherboard for a laptop, you might be surprised if you're used to seeing a nice square or rectangle motherboard in a PC. Laptops are completely different. So, all right, so here we have an example of a data bus. Traces are very small wires that are embedded into the motherboard itself. Now, if the trace was not embedded into the motherboard, it would require its own separate wire. So, but anyway, that wire connection, or what would otherwise be a wire, is built into the motherboard to reduce, well, a lot of things. For one, airflow is improved because you don't have all these wires in the way. Again, if you didn't have these traces that were built into the motherboard, several different layers of the motherboard, not only would it be a longer path between the devices that you're trying to connect, it would take up a lot of space inside the chassis, would interrupt airflow, be more easily damaged, right? There are lots of reasons why we want to keep those traces in place. It's also worth mentioning that that's why you never flex a motherboard or in any other I/O card, because that card, even though it looks like it's hard green or hard blue plastic, and that substrate is, right, it's hard, it's rigid, there are traces that are running through it. And you may have, that board may be like a sandwich, right? Or if you remember those old Sara Lee cakes, right? You've got, 4 or 5 levels or layers of that. And in between those layers, you have traces. So if you flex it, right? If you're monkeying around with it and decide to flex it just because it bends, you can break or damage those traces and render the board unusable, or worse yet, have some sort of intermittent error. So handle those with care. But in this example, a data bus has traces or lines that carry voltages interpreted by the CPU and other devices as bits. So this is showing now the memory, as we saw on a previous slide, the DIMMs will be connected to the North Bridge, and that's because the North Bridge handles the faster devices, and it is situated very, very close to the CPU. Again, it may look silly, it may be only an inch or two away from the, if that, from the CPU, whereas the South Bridge may be 3, maybe 4, depends on how big the motherboard is, but it looks like a negligible difference, but even that little bit of real estate can have a big impact on how the PC performs. The system clock is actually a small crystal that sits on the motherboard, and it vibrates really, really fast when electricity is applied to it. And that rate of vibration is what sets the speed for the other devices on the whole system. So the front side bus that they mentioned here, the processor, the other components are measured in hertz, which is 1 cycle per second. So on your motherboard, you will, if you look at it, you'll find a very small metallic cylinder, and that is usually your quartz crystal, which is what sets the speed. So the gigahertz and the megahertz here, the 1 million and the 1 billion cycles per second, that is how fast that crystal is vibrating when electricity is applied to it. And if you ever played piano or any other instrument where you have a metronome and it sets the speed right for your play, the system clock does the same thing. So if we were to slow it way, way, way down, right, every time the clock had a burst of electricity, it would send it out to the other board. So 1 click, 2 click, 3 click, and it's on each click, when I snap my fingers, that information is sent across the bus to the other devices. So that's an important, very important feature of how the modern PC and for that matter servers work. Now, I'm doing it very slow, obviously. 1 cycle, 2 cycle, 3 cycle. But if you were to speed that up to a megahertz or gigahertz, and your modern systems will all be using gigahertz, it's the same thing, just running many, many times faster. As I said previously, your CPU is not truly capable of multitasking in the way that we think of it. It's not actually doing these things simultaneously. It is time slicing it in such a way that it's servicing all those requests so quickly that it gives it the illusion that it's doing all these things at once. Well, it's the system clock that really makes that possible. So, also important point here at the bottom, motherboards can have more than one bus. Not only can they, but they do. Also, before I forget about it, we were talking about Intel and AMD a few minutes ago. It's important to note that if you're building out a system that you, especially if it's a multi-CPU system or replacing a CPU, you want to match your CPUs, especially in a virtual environment. But you want to match your CPUs, make sure they are the same family, not just the same manufacturer, but the same family and the same stepping level and the same memory, right? This is the onboard cache memory on the chip itself. Those need to match, especially in a virtualized environment, because if they don't match, well, I don't need to get into it, but it causes a lot of errors. Your chipsets on the board too will likely match. So AMD and Intel make chipsets, and for peak performance, it's usually a good idea to make sure that you match an Intel board to an Intel CPU and an AMD board to an AMD CPU. So failure to do so can cause a wide variety of oddities. The most basic of which is your system simply won't work, to other problems where it doesn't work as expected or designed. So anyway, just wanted to put that in there. Match your CPUs if you are in a multi-CPU configuration. So let's take a look at this slide on table 3.4. While we're looking at this slide, I will point out a couple of important things. Number one, if you look at the second row from the bottom, the FireWire is a high-speed serial transfer, and currently, considered state-of-the-art. Really, this is one of the faster transfer mechanisms that you'll find available. You notice that that's up to 3.2 gigabits per second. Now compare that to some of the earlier PCI Express buses. So up to 8 gigs per second for 16 lanes, up to the PCI 4 goes up to 64 gigs with 32 lanes. So that's quite a variation between those. Now the difference, of course, is one's transferring information serially, and the others are sending information in parallel. So and again, the parallel devices really went away with printers. It used to be that printers used parallel connectivity or parallel cables to attach to your PC, but serial has gotten good enough now, and really with the aid of chipsets. That's a major enhancement to this. It's not just the CPU. But you can see that we have quite a bit of, quite a number of robust bus types to select from. And your PC, if you were to open it up right now, you would see that you don't have a single PCI slot. You have multiple slots. Some of them are likely very short. Some of them are probably much longer. Some of them have one break in the socket itself. Others have two. Those solid pieces that run perpendicular to the rest of the slot are to make sure that you don't plug the wrong device into the wrong PCI slot, so it only goes in one way. So choose your devices carefully. But yeah, if you find yourself faced with buying one of those devices, again, an audio card or a RAID controller or a NIC card, then consult your PC's manufacturer. Make sure you understand what type of motherboards you have and just what sort of expansion opportunities you have. If you have an older box, it's possible that your PCI card would actually fit into the chassis, but because the CPU is an older generation or slow, that it wouldn't actually be able to talk to your card. So you might install it, see that it gets electricity, but then nothing happens. And if that's the case, there's probably a mismatch between the architecture with your PCI card and the CPU. All right, so now we're getting into a little deeper dive with the PCI categories. We'll try to go through this fairly quickly. Conventional PCI, and that stands for Peripheral Component Interconnect. Again, Peripheral Component Interconnect. And there's several different versions of this. Again, your own PC, if you're not using a laptop, if you're on a PC, you're likely to have several different iterations of this in your hardware right now. So the PCI slots or the PCI version 2X was when we made the move or made the jump from 32-bit to 64-bit hardware. Just to note, and you really can't find much of this anymore, but if you are buying a new PC or laptop, should you stumble upon an old 32-bit something or another, right? You find all sorts of deals out on the web. Confidently pass it by. If you're going to buy new hardware, please make sure that you're buying 64-bit hardware and you're going to be running a 64-bit operating system. It sounded like from the introduction last week that most of you are running Windows 10, probably running that on a 64-bit running the 64-bit version of that. And that's where you want to be. You might have some older operating systems, maybe even Windows XP, right? If you go back that old, that you are experimenting with or you keep around just to sort of tinker with, and that's great. But your primary workstation should be a 64-bit box, should be the latest operating system. And there are many reasons to do that. Of course, performance is one of them. But there are many enhancements to a 64-bit OS that make it worth the change. So anyway, PCI has been around for a long time, and there are several different versions available of that, depending on the type of card that you need to install. Not every card needs to be a high-speed device, which is again why you'll find that most PCs have a mix of PCI slots available. So here in this graphic, for example, if you look on the upper left-hand side, you have 4 slots that are, I'll call them manila colored, right? They're light colored. They're running perpendicular. And if you start on the edge of the PC, of the motherboard rather, and move in, you'll see that the 2 on the outside are keyed differently than these shorter ones. So let's take a look at these longer ones right here. You notice that there's I'll call it a break here, a break here, a break here, and a break here. So these are identical, and that keys your it keys the PCI card that can go into that slot, so that only a particular type of card will fit. Also, because this is further away, here's your CPU in the middle, right? Sorry, that's not your CPU. That's probably your North Bridge. You've got dual sockets here. Because these are further away from the CPU, it's likely that these are intended for slower speed devices. So you wouldn't have a high-speed PCIX port being far away from the PC, far away from the CPU. So this is likely your North Bridge here, this heatsink in the middle. It's also very close. These slots up here are your DIMM slots. This is your memory. So having this strategically located close to your CPU is very important. Different manufacturers will introduce different proprietary ways to compress or to move data around the bus. But when it gets right down to it, just how close you move the component to the actual CPU, and again, in this case, it has dual sockets. Just physical distance can make really the biggest difference. All right, PCIe, not backward compatible with conventional PCI or PCIX. And the reason is the slots won't fit. So you won't be able to plug in those devices into the conventional PCI or PCI-X devices. So it comes in 4 different slot sizes: 1X, 4X, 8X, and 16X. And the more X's in this case, the faster the card. Right? Those are referred to as lanes. So that's more data that you can move to your CPU or your chipset at one time. Right. Here's an example of that. So as we were looking at the previous example, we're in the far right-hand corner, if you will, of this particular motherboard. You notice that we have 2 PCIe X1 slots in here, and they're stubby. They're very short, right? So as I was saying previously, a card that would fit one of these older slots or one of these PCIe 4X slots, or certainly the 16X, will not fit into the 1X, right? And so they did that on purpose. Makes it easier for you to, 1, see the difference between the cards, and 2, will allow you to not make a mistake and damage the card by potentially installing it into the wrong slot. So briefly going through this slide, because I see we're running long today. The smaller versions of the PCI and the PCIe slots, they carry the same information, but they've been miniaturized to fit the small form factor of a PC. You notice the very last bullet point says the mini PCI slot is wider with 100 or 124 pins versus the E, which is 52 or 54 pins. Again, the most noticeable thing will be that notch difference, right? If you missed the pin count, then you'll certainly notice that the notch does not line up between the peripheral and the port. So here is an example of a PCI riser card. Now, a riser card would be used in a a server or a very low profile PC where the chassis is short. For a 1U box, for example, that means that you wouldn't have space to stand the card up in the chassis like you would with, say, a tower PC. So this riser allows you to install a standard PCI, PCIe, or PCIX card in a low profile box. The chassis again is very short, maybe a 1U box. And so it's just lying on its side. So same hardware, but this is kind of an L-shaped device. It plugs into the port, and then you can plug the card in so that it's perpendicular to the motherboard. So it allows you to save space in the installation. Otherwise, it's the exact same card. Doesn't require any specialized hardware beyond that one riser card. So onboard ports, I/O shield, internal connectors, right? This is going to vary according to manufacturer and how much PC or server you're buying. But in the norm, you'll find at least 1 or 2 of these on every one. So USB certainly is going to be there. If you're buying a PC, yeah, you're going to have some sort of built-in sound. Networking, FireWire, video, eSATA ports, right? Probably all common in a late model tower or desktop PC. Your other older motherboards, as it says here, and as we've seen in the slides earlier in this deck, you may have a PS2 style connector that's on an older PC, whereas in the new one, that's been replaced by USB, probably USB 3, maybe even faster. But having those uniform ports so that we can buy a device confidently and attach it to your PC without regard to who made it, right, non-proprietary, is a very important feature. So, I/O shield. What is an I/O shield? It's a plate installed in the computer case providing holes for onboard ports. So it also, and that's what it does, but I/O shield, right? So the shield part of it they didn't describe here, and that is it actually provides some limited shielding to other radiomagnetic interference near your PC. So, internal connectors, again, this may vary by your manufacturer, but it's safe to say that on a modern PC, you would have SATA ports and or USB and or FireWire. FireWire may actually be external. I would say that's more common than internal. For servers, right, not PCs, it's not uncommon to have these internal because you might set up a server that's booting off a USB drive, like just a thumb drive, and for that you have internal ports that you can plug into so that you don't have to have something hanging out the back of the server or the front. And there's several reasons to do that, not the least of which is security. Somebody might come along and swipe your USB key. Also, the accidental damage. If somebody comes along and is working on a system nearby and accidentally unplugs your USB key or breaks it, which these things happen more frequently than you might think, then you're in big trouble. So by providing internal ports right inside the chassis to protect those types of connections, it really does make everybody's life much easier. Right, configuring a motherboard. So configuring the motherboard is, most of these, for most vanilla installations, again, if you're building your own PC and all you want to do is check your email and watch a few YouTube videos, right, nothing very muscular, then your motherboard, probably out of the box with its default settings, is going to be just fine. Now, if you are installing some specialized peripherals, you may have to make some adjustments to the BIOS or UEFI in order for the device to be seen. Also, you might want to change things like the boot order, and that is you were telling the motherboard, or actually you're configuring the UEFI. So you say, hey motherboard, I want to start these devices in a particular order. So if you have a RAID card, for example, if you're not using the onboard disk controller, you have a separate standalone RAID card, then you might put the RAID card at the top of your boot order, right? Or if you're PXE booting, which means that you are booting your PC over the network, same thing, you might change your boot order. You can change really all the characteristics of your motherboard from the UEFI or BIOS. Again, it depends on which one you're using. UEFI is the replacement for BIOS. BIOS has been around for a long time. BIOS stands for Basic Input-Output System, whereas UEFI, UEFI, is Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. And it's much, much more capable than BIOS. It's really like its own operating system. And again, for most modern PCs, that's what you will find is really running your server. UEFI is required for high capacity or high density hard disks, for example. BIOS can only access up to, let me see, what is it, 2 gigabytes on the boot partition, and anything above that has to be either not on the boot partition, or if you like, you can use UEFI. But there are many other enhancements to UEFI, and not the least of which is that it's really built for a 64-bit environment. So as I said just a few minutes ago, if you are replacing your system or looking to do so in the near future, do so with 64-bit hardware and software. So, all right, so skipping right down this slide here, motherboards may use 3 types of firmware: BIOS, UEFI, UEFI with BIOS for backwards compatibility. And increasingly that's not true, especially in the server world. Increasingly, because UEFI's been with us for a while now, increasingly you have to pick one or the other. I'll give you an example, right? We had a customer not too long ago, big customer. Again, just a reminder and a disclaimer, I work for Lenovo Corporation. Anyway, we had a customer that went and updated the firmware on their server, and nothing was going wrong, but they decided, oh, I see there's a new release, I think I'll go ahead and update it. So we did, and when that happened, he couldn't see his disk drives any longer. And what had happened was when he updated the firmware, it set the firmware configuration, the UEFI, to default. And the default didn't recognize the RAID card that was installed. And so when it tried to boot, it went to the onboard controller. The onboard controller didn't have any drives attached to it, and that's where the problem started, right? It couldn't find any disk drives, and of course that really panicked the customer, et cetera, et cetera. So that again is just one example. In that particular server, it had to be BIOS or UEFI and not both. So. All right, using BIOS to set up using BIOS setup to configure a motherboard. So the hotkey that you'll use during post power on self test to access the BIOS setup screen is different on different systems. F1 is pretty common. You might find that that escape is also the hotkey, so that when you're booting up, you'll see in the bottom of the screen it'll say something like press F1 or press escape to enter the BIOS menu. Right, that's where you would jump in to configure any one of a number of changes. Right, could be energy efficiency, could be fan speeds, like I was talking about a few minutes ago. Could be really any characteristic of your particular server. Now, BIOS is not going to have as many choices as a UEFI system. Right, it's more, I'll use the term primitive than UEFI, but it still is important to, before you make any changes to your BIOS, that you understand what you're doing. The example that I just gave you is one of unintended consequences, right? This guy thought he was doing the right thing. Hey, there's a new BIOS or a UEFI update. I'll put that on my system. And he did so, and then spent several hours panicking that he had lost all his data. So once you enter the BIOS program, again, it says press a key or combinations of key during the boot process. That's also known as the hotkey or hot sequence. It does vary from manufacturer to manufacturer, although I would say 3 keys, F1, escape, and F10 are the most common. And see your documentation or watch the screen near the beginning. Now, there is a setting on some servers that's called quiet boot. Right, so it suppresses a lot of the messages that you might otherwise see. So something else, and this is non-destructive, you won't hurt anything, but if you don't know your hotkey and you can't seem to find your documentation, right, then go ahead and reboot it 2 or 3 times. Hit escape, hit escape, hit escape, or hit F1, 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 and if it keeps going into the OS, right, you can, one of a couple of things is going to happen. One, most motherboards will recognize your attempts to get into the BIOS as boot failures and will automatically go into the BIOS. So if F1's not doing it, but then you're rebooting immediately, and you do that 3 times in a row, that will often take you into the BIOS. Same thing with the other hotkey sequences. If you're pressing escape and that's not it, or F1 and that's not it, or F10 and that's not it, first of all, you should try all of those in the absence of having that documentation. But if none of those work, 3 successive boot failures typically will take you into the BIOS. And then from that point, you should be able to see what the hotkey sequence is. So, screen setup appears with menus and help features. Again, there are many different options inside the BIOS. I recommend that you record any changes that you make, which means that you write down any settings that are present upon boot up to make sure that you don't render the system unusable. I do recommend that if you've never gone into the BIOS on your laptop or PC before, that you do so during this class, not to make any changes, but just to make sure that you know how to get there in the event that you ever needed to make changes. Plus, it's just interesting to flip through and see how many different values you can change. Now, at the very end, or whenever you're finished, I would recommend that you hit escape, and at that point you'll be asked if you want to change, save changes, yes or no. Say no, all right, because you haven't made any changes, or if you did, you probably made some accidentally, and want to revert back to the values before you came in. But I do think it's a useful exercise, very instructive for you to take a little time and to explore your hardware and go into your BIOS. Right. Using setup BIOS to configure a motherboard. So a lot of things are plug and play these days, so some of this information may be dated. So I did mention boot sequence earlier, and they've got some examples here. You might need to change the boot sequence from hard drive to DVD for a new Windows install. Well, you can also do that from the splash screen, right? So when you're starting up your PC or your desktop, whatever, your manufacturer will typically flash the name up there. It'll say Lenovo or HP or whoever the manufacturer is. And at that point, at the bottom below the splash screen, you'll see a number of F keys, F1, F8, F7, etc. And you should see an option there for a boot sequence, and you can use that to temporarily hijack the boot sequence so that you don't have to make any hard changes. But again, some of this information is kind of dated, but we'll continue. After the OS install, you may need to change the BIOS to boot from the first from the hard drive. Again, if you've if you're building your own, maybe you need to make sure that your BIOS is configured to explicitly point to the first hard drive if you've got multiple hard drives installed, or if you have a RAID controller. But a lot of that should be a lot of that will be plug and play, which has gotten very good, especially Windows 10. Windows 2016, 2019, very, very good with detecting new devices. No longer is it plug and pray, right? That's much more common for earlier generations, say Windows 7 and earlier. The plug and play routine is really pretty good. Again, if we're talking specifically about Windows. So if you're troubleshooting a boot problem, be sure to set BIOS to perform full post test. And that's non-destructive. It's going to one of the primary things that it post test, and again that stands for power on self test, right? One of the primary things that post will do is check your memory. So if you've got a lot of memory, it may take a long time to run that test. You can interrupt the test, right? Just warning you that if you decide to go in and do a full test, that if you've got a lot of memory, that's easily the longest test, and it could take several hours for a post test to complete. So again, it's not changing anything. It's not going to overwrite anything. It's completely safe to do. This may take more time than you're thinking. Servers and PCs are very sophisticated, and they have their own chipsets that have out-of-band management devices that can record and report all of that information, including some PCs and servers have what we call loosely call home features. So if you have a hardware error, the error is immediately transmitted rather to the help desk, and if they need a new hard drive or a new fan or power supply unit, that's automatically ordered for them. So lots of features available for that, within that sphere. It's not just BIOS. There are some enhancements to that particular set of functions. So intrusion detection, this will happen if somebody tries to crack open the case, for example. Some PCs and servers have a small switch, and that switch it can do different things, again, depending on the BIOS setting. It may turn off the PC. It may send an alarm to the administrator that the case has been opened. Lots of different things that it can do there. But and again, that varies widely according to the BIOS and/or UEFI version that you're using. Power on passwords are a good additional security measures, I'd say, especially for portable devices. And it's just as it sounds, right? You turn on your PC, and before it can advance through the upper stages of the power on self-test and then hand things off to the BIOS, you're asked for a power on password. Now, if you don't give the right password, then the PC will not even power up. So again, for a laptop, that may make sense. Of course, if you forget your password, you could be in trouble. Some BIOS versions will allow you to go in and reset if you've got some sort of other master password. But there are others that if you don't know the password, you're simply locked out. So I would suggest that you use this with some level of caution. If you do use a power on password, make sure that it's a word or a phrase, probably a word, that you will not forget. Don't write it down anywhere, but make sure it's a word or a phrase that you will readily be able to recall, because doing so could, again, render your system unusable. In a worst case scenario, if you can't remember your power on password, you would have to replace the motherboard. So, BIOS support for virtualization. So there are lots of details here, probably more than we can really cover in this particular slide. But as I mentioned previously, one important configuration or a configuration concern is that if you're building or buying a PC or server that's going to be a virtual host, you need to make sure that your CPUs match. You also want to have a lot of memory. Probably want to have multiple NIC cards, dual at minimum, more if possible. And that can take quite a bit of planning. So virtualization is when one physical machine hosts activities that are normally done on multiple machines. Well, kind of, right? We've talked a little bit about virtualization already, and virtualization is running one PC as a virtual machine on another PC. So that VM is using all of the hardware and software available to the host to run its normal job. Now that VM may or may not know that it's virtualized, but the whole idea behind virtualization is that you are reducing the number of physical machines that you have in your environment. That's the primary reason. Of course, there are lots of other benefits. For example, being able to run multiple virtual machines on your laptop or desktop gives you the ability to have a small test lab with you virtually anywhere. So the virtualization is a very powerful tool. So virtual machine software is, or a virtual machine is software that simulates the hardware of a physical computer. Again, I don't know that I agree with this statement, but we'll work with it, and that is, virtualization does rest on top of what's called a hypervisor. A hypervisor is a thin layer of software that sits between the operating system or the virtual machine and the actual hardware, and it controls the interrupt requests to the actual hardware. So it's not a simulation at all, really. I mean, it's truly accessing the hardware. But what the hypervisor is doing is running multiple virtual machines on a single host, right? That will allow it to all of them to simultaneously use the same resources. So that's normally referred to as abstraction and not simulation. Simulation and emulation are often confused. Simulation is generally where you've got a simulator where somebody has written a piece of software, for example, that mimics an actual environment of some sort. And what this does is it allows you to make changes or to learn in a safe environment. But it's a simulation, meaning that if you're taking a quiz, for example, or if you're completing online exercises, if you don't do what the designer anticipated that you should do, even if it's correct in the real world, then you might fail the exercise on the simulator. Again, it's not the real thing. So, but virtual machines and virtualization are a very important mainstream technology now. So, everything is software defined and virtualized these days, almost everything, which would include networking, computing, and storage. Those are the big three. So you will, as you continue your studies at North Carolina Wesleyan, you will read more and more about virtualization. And it really is a technology, if you're not familiar with it now and you're planning to stay in the technology field, you really must become very well acquainted with virtualization. You can download a free hypervisor from Oracle. We can talk more about that later, but you can also download some free software from Windows for their Hyper-V hypervisor, VMware for their ESXi hypervisor, also VMware Workstation, which is meant to be installed on laptops or other smaller devices. Now it's important to note that Oracle VirtualBox and VMware Workstation are what is called Type 2 hypervisors, which means that they run on top of an operating system, like Windows 10, for example. Whereas the ESXi and there's an open source hypervisor called KVM, not to be confused with keyboard, video, mouse. But anyway, there are a number of choices in hypervisors, and it's a really, really big topic, something that you should pay close attention to during your studies here at North Carolina Wesleyan. All right, continuing our review here, LoJack for laptops, right? That is just what it sounds like. It's a way to track stolen devices. Remote wipe is becoming a pretty common feature for all manner of remote devices. Apple, for example, has made a big deal of promoting that as a security protocol, so that if somebody steals your device, your data is your most important asset, second only to your phone itself, but at least they can wipe the phone and make the phone unusable. Or, as we saw with some riots earlier this year, I think it was in New York, a bunch of protesters broke into an Apple store and stole equipment, and Apple put out an announcement saying, we will track you. We can and we will track you. So as soon as these devices show up on the network, we'll be coming to look for you. So no word yet on if that's produced any arrests or if they've been able to locate any of this equipment. So LoJack helps you find, it is a third-party tool, but it can help you find missing hardware. Drive encryption and drive password protection. If you think of IT security as a whole bunch of different layers, like your username and password is the first layer, maybe the next layer is to have the power on password, and then there's the OS username and password, and then beyond that you may have drive encryption and drive password protection, meaning that if somebody stole your laptop, I'll stay with the laptop example for a moment, stole your laptop, pulled out the hard drive and ran home, put it in a similar laptop or other device, they would not be able to read the data, right, without the password because it's encrypted. All right, that can be, that's very important. It's also, there are a number of technologies that allow you to encrypt traffic as it moves across your motherboard. We won't get into that today, but yeah, the drive encryption. Oh, the biggest thing holding back drive encryption is the current state of our technology. In other words, it's not, our CPUs are not fast enough. If we could encrypt all data all the time, data in use, data in motion, data at rest, right? Those are the three data states: data in use, data in motion, data at rest. If we could encrypt data in all three states, which is to say all the time, then a lot of our information security problems will go away. The problem is that the decryption part of this is so CPU intensive, right? It slows things down to unacceptable levels. So that's why we don't see widespread blanket encryption being applied to assets everywhere. TPM is actually the name of a working group, not only the technology. And it's not proprietary. It's not a Lenovo or an Intel or an HP or a Dell technology. It is an industry-wide research group, and this sort of capability is available to freely available to most manufacturers to, again, reduce the incident of computer theft or data theft. Right, internet or IT security rather is a huge problem and becoming more problematic every day. So TPM is just one technology out of many that is working to make our online lives safer and more secure. So here is another screenshot, right? Going into the motherboard to configure it. So here we are exiting the BIOS. You can also hit F10 to save and exit. You can hit F9 and on the keyboard to set everything to the default. So if it's a first-time installation, that F9 is probably not a bad idea. Again, consult your manual for specifics, but and you might decide to exit without making any changes at all. Again, if you're going to look at your BIOS on your current system, then that's obviously the option that I would recommend. Please don't make any changes to a working system unless you have good reason to do so. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Maintaining a motherboard. So pretty simple, right? A motherboard is considered a field replaceable unit, FRU, and you can update drivers, you can update the BIOS of the UEFI, and you can replace the CMOS battery. Again, the CMOS battery, complementary metal oxide semiconductor, right? It's that coin-shaped battery that we looked at a little earlier, that ch03 model that I mentioned, which they're actually pretty cheap. That's the good news. Now, since we started with CMOS batteries, I'll stay with that. CMOS batteries are inexpensive, and they have one job, and that is to preserve the settings in your BIOS, which includes your clock settings. So if your CMOS battery dies, you're going to get an error when you boot your system. Right, it's going to let you know that your CMOS battery has died. You might actually get a series of beep codes from your BIOS to alert you to the fact that your CMOS battery has died. And if you've got some non-standard configuration, you might also notice that your CMOS battery has died because you can't boot into your OS any longer. So don't panic, right? If your system is 2 or 3 years old, which is reaching the end of its lifespan anyway. But if it's 2 or 3 years old, check your CMOS batteries first. You can buy those for $3. More if you want to buy a multi-pack. But replace your CMOS battery, reset your BIOS, and before you run down to Geek Squad and see if that will fix your problem. It probably will in a lot of cases, unless of course, you've had a lightning strike or a power surge or something like that. But anyway, the CMOS battery is a 1 screwdriver out of 4 screwdriver in terms of technical difficulty replacement. And one thing I would say is that you need to be careful. The CMOS battery slides out of its socket. It does not come up. There's a stiff arm that actually holds the battery in place. That's on top, and if you try to pull the battery up, you will snap off that arm. So the CMOS battery does slide out from under that arm, and I think once you get in there, you'll see that that's pretty simple. So plenty of YouTube videos out there for how you can do that operation. So what are the other items that you can change here? Update motherboard drivers, update or flash the BIOS and the UEFI. I would say these are as needed only. So we'll start with UEFI and BIOS. Unless you have a good need, and this is true even in a data center environment, unless you have a really good reason for updating your BIOS or your UEFI, leave it alone. You may introduce other problems. So what's a good reason? Well, number one reason, security. If there's a security bulletin out there that references your particular BIOS and or operating system combination or manufacturer or what have you, then obviously you need to update the BIOS or the UEFI, right? It's a security threat. Beyond that, unless there's something wrong that is preventing your system from operating properly, like you've installed a new piece of hardware, then again, the best advice is not to update. You should not update firmware just because there's a new version, right? The updated firmware may not even apply to your system in terms of whatever enhancements they've made, may not even apply to your system. Plus, BIOS manufacturers or firmware programmers make mistakes, so the new firmware may break something else. That's an entirely possible and common scenario. So again, unless you have a real need to update your BIOS or your firmware or your drivers, don't do it. Leave it at its current working level. Okay, updating motherboard drivers. So device drivers are small programs that allow software to interact with certain hardware. Again, most of you are using Windows 10 for your OS of choice in this class, and Windows, it does a really good job with maintaining their device drivers, their DDLs. That stands for data link libraries, which are the drivers. So they do a really good job with supporting most hardware platforms. So unless you've got a really odd piece of hardware, right, something that is brand new to the market perhaps, or very specialized, I don't know, maybe you've got a piece of software that's used for Geiger counters. That's probably not something that a lot of people would use. And as such, you may have to dig around a little bit to find a driver that will work with a device. But in the main, Windows does an excellent job of locating drivers when you boot up and can install those automatically for you. So continuing down this list here, Windows use Windows internal drivers, bundled CD drivers, or download drivers to the manufacturer's website. You might find that many of your manufacturers, Dell, HP, and Lenovo, all offer services that will allow you to install a very small program on your laptop or PC, and then it will detect all of that information for you. What's your current BIOS version or your other drivers versions, and what do you need updated? Is this a critical update? Is it not applicable to your system? It'll give you a full report on what it finds with regard to what's installed on your system and what you may or may not need to do. If you have malware on your laptop, for example, that may, of course, not be related to firmware at all, and you may need to look instead of doing some sort of restore to a previous level of your firmware, or making some other changes. Typically, if you are infected with some sort of malware, reflashing the BIOS and or reinstalling drivers typically won't help you with removing or overriding malware on your system. So, flashing BIOS. So flashing BIOS is the process of upgrading or refreshing the programming stored on the firmware chip. So there are two basic ways to do this. One is to boot to a device that will flash the firmware onto your laptop or your server. The other is to boot into the OS, and the OS will queue the update so that when you reboot the system, it will apply the update for you. And still some systems will allow you to update firmware on minor chipsets without rebooting the system at all. But anyway, let's go through the slide. BIOS updates are downloaded from the motherboard manufacturer's website or third-party site, which means your manufacturer. So again, if you've got whatever manufacturer you have, you should consult their website before making any changes or updates to your hardware. So once you apply the update, right, you could run into some problems, right? System hangs at odd times, motherboard becomes unstable, incorporate a new feature or a new component, new hardware, right? These are all good reasons to consider updating your firmware or updating your BIOS. But before you do, right, try to understand why that new device made your PC unstable. Is it in fact supported for your hardware? It may not be. If it's not supported by the manufacturer, you could void the warranty for your PC or server. Or at the that's the worst case scenario, or the best case, that it won't void the warranty, but it's simply not designed to work with it. Therefore, you can't get any support from the manufacturer. So neither one of those is really an enviable case. So what this means is when you're buying a new software title, perhaps it's a game or something else, or you're buying additional hardware for your PC or laptop, it's a good idea to check to make sure your system is compatible first. The other 3 bullet points on here are absolutely spot on. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Only update if you're having trouble with a motherboard. Absolutely. You don't want to update it simply because you see there's a new one available. You should research your problem and see if the BIOS update addresses the problem you're having. Don't update unless the update is a later version of the one that's installed. In fact, some BIOSes won't let you roll back. So if you install a new version of the BIOS and it either 1 doesn't fix the problem or 2 introduces a new problem, right, that could could be stuck. It may not let you roll back, or you may be several BIOSes back, which means that you couldn't jump from the current version to the latest version. You may have to do several iterations in between. So you'll need to consult your manufacturer's information. Certainly, they should have some sort of setup information to let you know what your upgrade options are. And finally, the update should not be interrupted while it's flashing. That can brick your system, truly. If you, for the sake of example, let's say you're doing an update and you lose power, right? Then the update could very well stall, or the machine may shut off if you don't have a strong battery and it's a laptop, and that could, like I say, brick the system, from which there's no return. If it fails during a firmware update, your laptop could be rendered useless. All right, flashing UEFI. This is a lot like flashing BIOS, but we'll go through some of this. UEFI updates are more secure than BIOS updates. Require digital signatures for the update to be verified. So what it's doing there is making sure that nobody has made modifications to the UEFI, so that by installing their version of the update, which may look a lot like the official, that they're installing some sort of backdoor to your system. UEFI firmware drivers and databases can be updated by way of USB flash drive from within Windows. Again, BIOS is the same way. Windows updates sometimes include UEFI updates. That is true, which means that if you go to the Windows website and download an update, it may have a multi-step update that will incorporate elements of UEFI. So follow the manufacturer's directions very carefully when you're making either update. Again, don't flash or don't provide an update unless you have a good reason for doing so. Using jumpers to clear BIOS settings, and I agree with the information that's included on this slide. For the most part, right, these are not universal statements. So what is a jumper? A jumper is a small plastic, generally plastic device, right, with 2 ports in it. And when you put a jumper on top of the posts that they're mentioning here, that completes the circuit. Once the circuit is complete, then it allows to flush or reset some bit of memory that will undo perhaps a forgotten supervisor password or a power on password, or undo a failed BIOS. Again, these are not universal statements, and your motherboard may not allow this, but it's certainly worth checking your documentation if you run into a situation like this where you all of a sudden can't get in for a variety of reasons. So also, this is mostly a desktop statement or a server statement and not a laptop statement. You will not find jumpers on a modern laptop. Replacing the CMOS battery. complementary metal oxide semiconductor. So the CMOS battery, again, its one and only job is to make sure that it properly refreshes, restores, maintains your BIOS settings, so that if you unplug your PC, right, that you can come back later and plug it in, or your laptop, right, you can plug it in and your settings will be persistent. Your system will still boot. All the settings that remember where your devices are will still be present. That's what a CMOS battery does. So CMOS is, again, they're available many places. They're inexpensive. It does use a small amount of RAM to store this data, and just like your larger DIMMs, it needs to be electrically active in order to keep that information. So to replace the CMOS battery, again, I would rate this 1 screwdriver out of 4 in terms of technical difficulty. Choose the correct replacement. Make sure that you drain the system power. Make sure you're using an ESD strap. Also, you want to see, you can probably read the battery model before you remove it from the system. Again, one really common type is called ch03. It's used on a lot of different hardware. So, but take a look and see what what is being used. Also, don't pull the battery straight up. Slide it out. You may need a small tool like a spudger in order to do that. But yeah, otherwise they're very easy to replace. They slide in and they slide out. And because they're so inexpensive, if you're getting some errors like a 1962 error, no operating system found, or your laptop or desktop is losing its time settings, before you start looking for exotic problems, take a look at your CMOS battery and see if that might not be the issue. Installing or replacing a motherboard. Now this is a big job, and it's a big job for a number of reasons. For example, when you remove your motherboard, you have to take out all the other components in the chassis. Now that may sound commonsensical, but the reason I'm pointing it out is this. Your risk of incidental damage is very, very high when you have to pull out all of that hardware. ESD, dust, other damage from dropping components, losing components, not installing them correctly when you're returning it to the chassis, over tightening screws, under tightening screws, leaving hardware in the chassis, etc., etc., etc. As you can see, there are a number of risks to doing this. So I would say that if you do make the decision to replace a motherboard, that you have good reason to do so. It may be that it's time to think about replacing the entire system and not just your motherboard. So a motherboard is considered a field replaceable unit, which means that you would need a technician to do it, generally speaking. A technician needs to know how to select an appropriate motherboard or install and replace one in a desktop or laptop computer. If this is one of those instances too where if you've got a fairly new machine and your motherboard fails, you may want to check your documentation and see if you have a warranty available before you make any changes like this on your own, because again, the risk of collateral damage, damaging components that are otherwise functioning properly, is very, very high. So if you do have an unexpected failure, it may be a good time to think of replacing the entire unit with a brand new box, so that you get faster. All your other devices at that point should be faster generation of CPU, faster or more memory, faster hard drives. You may decide to go from SATA to SAS or SSD, or a combination of both. So there are many things to consider beyond just replacing the motherboard. But anyway, if you've decided to go down the path of replacing the motherboard should have a model number on it, and you can use it to shop around to find the exact one, preferably, or similar. Oftentimes, unfortunately, that information, that serial number, is hidden under the CPU. So you may have to at a minimum, pull off the heatsink in order to see the motherboard manufacturer information, which could include the serialized information for the board itself. So once you have that information in hand, you can start your search to see if see what sort of hardware is available. Continuing with how to select a desktop motherboard, again, this is driven as much by cost as some of these other factors. So, what form factor do you want? Do you want a desktop? Do you want a tower? Do you want a tiny? Lots of different things to think about. What brand do you want to select? And this may impact the types of software that you can run on the hardware once you're complete. There's also a cost. Generally speaking, AMD will be more expensive than, Intel will be more expensive than AMD generally, not always. So, and those prices change quite a bit and frequently. So be sure to look at your board options. Chipsets and memory speeds on the boards will vary a lot. Expansion slots, how many do you need? Again, my advice from earlier still stands. I would buy as much PC, within reason, as you can buy at the time of purchase. The fastest CPU, the most memory, the most storage space, the fastest storage space. Go ahead and capture those gains up front. And if you need to add additional hardware later, you'll have the capacity to do so. So hard drive controllers, case, price, and warranty support, all important features. You may consider a support contract if you're working, if this is for business needs, so that you have the security and peace of mind that if you do have a failed PC, that you can call somebody to come out and take care of it quickly. It won't be you trying to figure out late one night or on the weekend what your problem is. If you've paid for warranty, then you should exercise that and use that as a learning experience. Watch what the tech's doing, and perhaps next time you could put some of that knowledge to good use. So continuing in how to install or replace a motherboard. So once you have selected the replacement, the rest of this is pretty straightforward. Verify the process for replacing the motherboard. Verify right motherboard is selected. All right. Make sure it's going to accept the CPU we have, for example. If you've got an AMD, make sure the new board is compatible with an AMD, and vice versa for Intel. Get familiar with documentations, features, and settings. Absolutely. Remove components to reach old motherboard. So we looked at this last week. These would be things like your hard drives, any optical drives you might have, fans, case fan, maybe a CPU or hard drive fan, power supply. Right? There are likely to be a number of items that you need to clear, including the wiring harnesses, right, before you can actually get to the motherboard. Install the I/O shield metal plate. Install the motherboard. Install processor and processor cooler. That's the heat sink on top of the processor, generally with a fan attached to that. Install the RAM, and then install the cabling, case switches, power supply, etc. So we saw all of that last week. Generally speaking, when you power all that on, your PC should start up. If it does not, you're likely to receive a series of beep codes. Those beep codes are a good way to diagnose whatever problem it's having. You might have reversed or changed the boot order for your hard drives, for example. You might have not put your DIMMs in or seated those properly. You may not have properly attached your case fan or your hard drive fan. There are many things that that because of the tight tolerances, even in a tower chassis, may cause problems with the first time you start it up. None of those issues are fatal, and once corrected, should allow your system to restart. So here we are continuing down our checklist, right? And I'll let you read through some of this at your leisure as well. right? Again, we're basically putting everything back into the box and powering it up. Um, we're watching post, we're verifying Windows starts, we're doing all the things that you would expect to do when you're finished putting that new motherboard. I would add at least one more item, and that is once you get all the hardware back in the box, and you're to the point where you're ready to apply power. Assuming you don't have any leftover parts or you're missing something, pick up the chassis and give it a very gentle shake or turn it upside down and see if anything falls out, moves around, clatters around inside the box. And obviously, if it does, you need to locate that. If there is a loose screw or a washer or something else, banging around in the box, and you apply power to it, it could short out the chassis. So obviously you can't wait until if you power it on, you get some sort of arcing inside the box. It's too late at that point probably to go back and find it. The damage at that point is likely already done. Replacing a laptop system board is completely different, as you might imagine, from replacing the motherboard in a server or a PC. A laptop motherboard really, compared to the other items we looked at in this module, looks nothing like what you would anticipate to be a motherboard. And there are a number of reasons for that, but there are other design characteristics to consider when replacing a laptop system board. The very first question you should ask is if you think that you're capable of doing it. And that's not an idle question. You need to have the right tools. It's more than just having a proper screwdriver to remove the screws out of the laptop base, but do you have a torque wrench? Do you have tools that you can use to safely pry open the laptop case? The laptop is built in such a way that it doesn't really want to come apart, which makes sense if you think about the type of work that you do with one. So before you decide to disassemble a notebook, make sure that you feel comfortable doing so. It's a very precise task. Getting the few wires that are in the chassis back into their channels and making sure that you can snap everything back together can be really pretty challenging. Also, there's the potential that you may actually break something, a clip or a bezel cover or something similar, and though it would be more than just replacing the motherboard, it might be actually replacing some of these other trim panels and pieces as well. So parts are also very small, smaller than what you might necessarily see with a PC or a server. So before you decide to disassemble one, make sure that it's not under warranty, and that if for some reason you weren't able to reassemble it in quite the same way that it was disassembled, that you could live with those results. So, all right, with that said, let's go on to the next slide. So finally, we've talked for almost 2 hours about the motherboards, and there are many things obviously to consider when you are looking to upgrade or replace your motherboard. The primary thing I would ask you to consider is whether or not it really needs to be done. Here's why. Even for minor repairs, my favorite example of this is when you're working with a server that has a broken RJ45 plug, the network plug, because this happens quite a lot. So you take a relatively minor problem, right? You've got a broken port on your motherboard, and you can escalate it until something pretty serious, because again, it requires the full disassembly of your PC. So in doing this, you could damage other components. You could also experience some data loss. And there is the potential that once you put it all back together, that it may not start properly. All this is not to say that I'm trying to dissuade you from doing these tasks, but not to take these on with a cavalier air. Well, it is not a trivial set of tasks. So with that said, let's take a look at these bullet points. The motherboard is the most complicated of all components inside a computer. It certainly is the most feature-laden and the most dense in terms of integrated circuits and what have you. The most popular motherboard forms are ATX, micro ATX, and mini ITX. Motherboard will have one or more processor sockets. Doesn't mean, by the way, that you have to have both processors installed. If you happen to have a motherboard with dual processor sockets, yeah, you obviously need to have at least one, but you can also run it without both CPUs installed. So if that's an expansion path for you later, right, you should be able to use the server or high-end desktop with one PC until that extra hardware is required. A chipset is embedded on the motherboard and determines what kind of processor memory are supported. Of course, chipsets do a lot more than just that. They're talking specifically here about North Bridge and South Bridge. And as I mentioned earlier, the chipsets, if you are running or using multiple CPUs, you do need to make sure those CPUs match. And not just the same manufacturer, but they're the same manufacturer, same model, as well as same stepping level. So not having the PC with matched CPUs can cause all sorts of performance issues. So again, if you're going to invest that much money into building out your own PC, then you need to make sure that you select those components carefully. Buses include several different types, but ultimately what they are pathways from some sort of expansion component to the CPU. And these specialized devices need the access to the CPU so that they can operate at peak performance. The CPU is ultimately obviously the piece of hardware that determines how the rest of the PC will function. So having that direct interrupt access to the CPU, especially for things like high I/O activity, things like a RAID card or even a NIC card or a video card, can have an impact on other components inside your server or workstation. So again, make sure that all of that's compatible before buying it. Sometimes we get excited about seeing a good deal on a particular component. Please do your research carefully and make sure that if you're buying those items a la carte, that they are in fact compatible with one another. Firmware that controls a motherboard and the boot order is the older BIOS and the newer UEFI. And there are systems that will allow you to switch back and forth between the two, but they need to be BIOS or UEFI, not both. It is not possible to use both systems simultaneously. Settings can be changed, so that is true. Your settings for either one, BIOS or UEFI, can be modified as your needs require. Maybe your security settings will change. Perhaps you will change the out-of-band management channel access. That might be your IP or might be your power on password. All that can be monitored or modified at a later time. You do want to keep that information safe, however, as somebody that had either one of those could use it to either your out-of-band management IP and or username and password, power on password, etc. could use that to compromise your system. And here's our last slide. Motherboard drivers and or BIOS might need to be updated to fix a problem. But again, unless there is a problem, don't go looking to update your BIOS. It is certainly possible, and I've seen it happen many times, that you can take a perfectly functioning system and reduce it to a non-perfectly functioning system. You can cause yourself a lot of unnecessary headache just by updating firmware because it was available. Again, you should have a specific task in mind. Security goes to the top of the list. If you have a security issue, perhaps with the kernel that you're running, then you should absolutely patch. Anything less than that needs to be considered carefully. CMOS battery, its only job in life is to make sure that it preserves your BIOS and or UEFI settings in the event of a power outage. That means that if it does lose those settings, you might get some odd behavior during a boot up, but while the system is running, provided you can get past boot up, while the system is running, the BIOS, the CMOS battery doesn't actually do anything. But if you're having problems with boot up, getting odd beep codes, for example, any other unwanted behavior, if your system is at least 2 years old or older, you might want to check the CMOS battery and see if that's been drained. When selecting a motherboard, pay attention to the form factor. There are many, especially the number of expansion slots. The smaller the motherboard, the fewer the expansion slots. So if you're looking to build out later, you want to make sure you buy the right motherboard to give you that opportunity. Study the motherboard manual before installing it. And finally, for laptops, it's usually more cost effective to replace the laptop than to replace a failed motherboard, which is absolutely correct. Plus, you might save yourself some sanity points. I think it's a useful exercise for you to disassemble a laptop if you have one that can be sacrificed. But I absolutely agree with the statement that it probably is more cost effective. Plus, it's really quite challenging to put everything back snapped into place, properly grounded, all the screws torqued in place, etc. Laptop is really pretty challenging when it comes to replacing a motherboard. So, all right, well, that's all for Chapter 3. Thanks for listening, and have a good day.